recorded on this computer. And we can start just by looking at the syllabus, okay? The syllabus is dynamic. It's undergoing changes. So you're going to want to reload it because I changed it. I changed the order of the lectures a little bit. And we'll look at that in a minute. So you know when the class is, okay, we've found the room. This was the Zoom from last year. It still seems to work. So I'm just going to keep it. We have a TA, Rick Gow. There's his email here. And the lectures that I record for this and any other things that I put up as recordings of lectures will be on this YouTube playlist. Okay, so that's the focus of those lectures. Sometimes I'll put up lectures from previous years if there's a lot of overlap, but you're only responsible for the stuff that happens in this lecture this year, right? So if there's stuff, you know, ancillary information in these other lectures that you're looking at, it's not going to show up on a quiz, etc. Then you should be able to see in modules here the lecture slides. So before the lecture, I will post a PDF of the slides that are going to occur in that lecture, and then you can annotate those slides as you wish as a PDF. And so I'll keep a step ahead and try and post these as far ahead as I can so that you can download them. And then the new syllabus is here, also in modules. So the two textbooks that are that most of the material is taken from for these lectures are Prints and Links, which we used in 280A. How many people took 280A? Can I see a show of hands? Just so about 30. Okay. So Prints and Links is a basic textbook on medical imaging. When I say basic, it approaches it from a EE standpoint, or from a signal processing standpoint. And the other book that I'll take material from and figures that show up in slides and things like that is The Essential Physics of Medical Imaging. And this is medical imaging from the medical physics standpoint, as opposed to the EE standpoint. And so it's a more, I want to say, pragmatic or practical view of medical imaging. It's a really good textbook. I mean, it's quite comprehensive. So if you want something that covers all medical imaging, it's a good thing to buy. And you can get it secondhand if you just keep looking. Eventually a copy will come by for 30 bucks or something. Amazon is very odd these days, right? In buying secondhand books, so they can be 30 or they can be 750, the same book. And so just keep looking. Red Shelf will have Prints and Links, and you can access that. If you took 280A, it may still work. I'm not sure. But otherwise, Red Shelf will have Prints and Links for about 40 bucks, I think, for the duration of the course. And so those are the primary sources for the material in the course. This says 4th edition. The 3rd edition is fine. It's just as good. You know, the principles haven't changed much over that time. In terms of grading, the way I'm looking at it right now is we're going to do 40% on homeworks. There'll probably be about 4 homeworks across the course, 4 or 5. A paper presentation or a project. If you want to go into depth into a paper or 2 or 3 papers on a topic and present that to the class, that's fine. If you want to do a MATLAB project about some specific aspect of medical imaging that we're discussing, that is also fine. And then we'll have 2 small quizzes, one in the middle and one at the end. Okay, and they're only worth 10% each, and they're truly big quizzes. do you know what was talked about in the lectures? Can you, tell me something about medical imaging that we talked about in the lecture? So all you really have to know is what is discussed in the lectures for that. Any questions thus far in terms of this? I know that, wearing a mask for 2 hours or whatever, some people don't like doing it. So you're welcome to watch these lectures in the comfort of your own home. Although now I am not allowed to give the lectures in the comfort of my own home. Yeah.
Do you anticipate that there should be partial coding and then partial written response?
There is, yes, is the answer. And some of the homeworks will involve using software packages that are widely available for analyzing images, right? So we'll do some exercises about taking actual images and looking at their characteristics using some simple, software. Okay. Any other questions? All right, so I think we can get started then on today's lecture. Any questions from those online? If you want to put it in the chat, I'll be able to see it for about 10 seconds. I don't have another screen when I'm working here. Okay, so we're gonna go, yeah. Okay, here's my contact. If you have any questions at any time, just shoot me an email and I'll try and get back to you as soon as possible. We just went over all this, you know where we are. And so here's some info on that textbook. It's a really good book. I enjoy this book a lot. And these are the modalities that we'll be looking at. Oftentimes the examples of images are going to be images of the heart, because that's what I do in my lab, and I've done it for 35 years, so I have a lot of those images. I don't image the brain ever, actually, although many of the principles we're gonna talk about are the same everywhere in the body. But the major modalities we'll look at are, in the order that we're gonna look at them now, is basically nuclear medicine, including single photon emission computed tomography, which is SPECT, it's called, and positron emission tomography, which is PET. And this is where you inject an agent into the patient and they glow, and you image their glow. Right? Ultrasound, which has a handheld transducer, and you put it on the patient, it shoots a beam of sound waves into the patient with longitudinal sound waves, and then listens for reflections of that sound and then creates an image by that. We'll look at X-ray fluoroscopy, which is a very simple mechanism of putting somebody on a table, shooting X-rays through them, and looking at how the shadow of the patient looks. And oftentimes you inject a contrast agent into the patient so that you see their vascular structure or other structures inside the patient that take up contrast. And we're going to review MRI and CT, and this is particularly useful for those of you who didn't take 280A. In 280A, we really went into a lot of detail about these two imaging modalities. And then what I'd like to do towards the end of the course, in like the last 4 lectures or so, is look at how medical physicists, electrical engineers, etc., compare different imaging modalities in terms of their performance. And the question is, does this imaging modality perform as we designed it? What is it good for in terms of its application in medicine? Does it answer an important question in medicine? Or is it an ancillary technique that gives us information we probably already have? So that has a technical component, and it has a statistics / clinical trialsy type component, right? The technical component is, did we make the machine we were after in terms of its spatial resolution, signal to noise, temporal resolution, etc. And then once we've got that machine, does it in fact change the management of patients? You can make a lot of pretty pictures that don't change the management, right? In fact, you know, when I recently had children here in San Diego, they have this, I forget what the place is called, but it's a completely private ultrasound center. Some would call it recreational ultrasound, where you can go in like the 7th, 8th month of pregnancy, and they'll just make fantastic movies of your child, right? And it's really cool. I mean, you spend an hour there and you're watching, you know, them do whatever, suck on their toes and things like that. And it is entirely for recreation. There's no medical benefit will come out of that, unless they discover something that wasn't discovered in the clinical ultrasound, which is probably pretty rare, right? In fact, you sign a waiver probably saying that they don't have to find things that are in the images, right? Kind of a risky business taking pictures, because there can be something there that you miss, right? And that comes back to be a problem. So any questions about these modalities, or is there a modality missing that you're hoping is going to be here? Oh, okay, great. So we're going to compare these modalities. So looking at the, you guys have this on your screen too. Let me get this down here. That might work better. Okay, great. So looking at those modalities that we've listed there, these are some of the physical parameters and properties of those imaging techniques. And it's truly remarkable, the dynamic range that these things have. So how long does it take for each one of these imaging modalities to make a picture, right? And it ranges from, you know, X-ray fluoroscopy, in which, you know, you have a 5 millisecond flash of X-rays, just boom, just like a picture. And then you do that 30 times a second to make a movie. But the actual picture itself, the exposure time is only about 5 milliseconds, right? So it's just like a camera, right? Versus nuclear medicine, in which the patient is lying there for a long time, for minutes, right? To basically acquire all of the counts and all of the data to make this picture. So that picture is an average, right, over 4 minutes or something. And this picture is an average over 5 milliseconds. And so it's obviously you're going to get quite different pictures, right? This one will freeze motion, and it'll freeze cardiac motion, it'll freeze respiratory motion. You could be running through the scanner, it would probably freeze that, right? This one, on the other hand, all of that stuff gets bundled together. And if the object's moving around, you have to compensate for that somehow, right? Echocardiography or ultrasound is somewhere between those, in that you can acquire data sort of on 30 millisecond windows and play it back at 30 frames per second. The voxel dimension, I call it voxel dimension instead of resolution, because normally this is how the image is displayed. So when you put it up on a computer, you have to decide how many pixels do I put in my image, right? You want the number of pixels actually to be greater than the actual spatial resolution of the mechanism, right? You want to sample it at a higher spatial resolution than the image provided. So usually the voxel dimension is, you know, a factor of 2 smaller than the true spatial resolution of the imaging technique, right? And so this gives the characteristic usual voxel dimensions of these data sets. And there's 3 dimensions, X, Y, and Z, right? That's why it's called a voxel as opposed to a pixel. And echocardiography is like 3 by 3 by 3, something like that. Sort of in the sweet spot of the beam, that's going to be a resolution. You look down at that X-ray fluoroscopy in the 5 milliseconds, we're talking 0.15 by 0.15 millimeters in the projection or the you know, XY direction, but the X-ray beam goes through the entire patient. So it's an average of the X-ray attenuation through the entire patient. So it's huge in this dimension. This is why a contrast agent is very useful. You inject it into a vessel, then really the vessel stands out inside that volume. So you've eliminated this averaging through the whole thing by putting high contrast object in there that's small. If we look at MRI, which probably comes next in terms of voxel size and time, to do a 2D MRI scan that is nice to look at. You can make an MRI scan in 100 milliseconds, but it sure isn't nice to look at it, right? It really stinks. Well, it's low resolution or high noise. From my experience, I did MRI for 25 years. The sweet spot is about 10 seconds, somewhere around there. For a 2D image, you're going to get a picture that is pretty spectacular, right? And I mean, it's an interesting concept. Oh, the image is spectacular. Does that mean you can find something in it? That's the more fundamental question. But here, say you're imaging something that's moving, say the heart, which is periodic. You can trigger the acquisition of the MRI to acquire data for each heartbeat, right? And assume that each one of those heartbeats is the same, right? And so now you're piecing together a raw data set that's quite large and has a lot of detail in it by taking heartbeat 1, then heartbeat 2, then heartbeat 3. Put all that data together, right? And you get this high resolution image, and you get it at multiple time frames, you know, through the heart cycle. And so when you finish doing that, you can play back a movie at like 25 frames a second, and you see these, you know, moving hearts, and they're spectacular. It's absolutely beautiful. It's the same for if you're looking at flow in somebody's brain, right? If you're looking at an aneurysm and you want to know, is there flow circulating around in that aneurysm, you would do this MRI acquisition and average and gate to the heart, because you're assuming that flow is going to be reproducible on each pulse, right? Same with flow in the aorta. If you're measuring a big flow field or something, you assume that they repeat. Which, given my experience in imaging cardiovascular stuff in the vessels, it's remarkably reproducible. If the heart rate is the same and you have a chamber and there's blood flowing into that chamber, it's extraordinary how this swirling pattern will repeat each beat. It'll look identical. The thing that will change it is if the heart rate changes. Say you skip a beat and then the volume changes, and then, you know, the dynamics can change, and so that'll throw a wrench into your data acquisition. So as long as the heart rate's constant, and you should do okay. That's 2D. So that means you get a slice, just one slice. Now you get to pick that slice wherever you want with MR. You just arrange it using the gradients in the magnet, and just say, okay, I'll do a coronal slice, or I'll do an axial slice, or sagittal, etc. So you get to pick it. 3D MRI, you wind up with a 3D data set, which are true voxels, but obviously you have to encode the information in the slice direction. You can do it just by taking one slice, then the next, then the next, then the next, and stack them together. That's often done. Or you can encode everything together in 3D, and you get this kind of voxel resolution, 1 millimeter in the readout direction by 3 millimeters in the phase encode direction by 5 millimeters in the slice direction, something like that. And then there's CT, which the patient is lying in the scanner. We'll see pictures of all these, how they get. The gantry is rotating around the patient quite quickly, sort of 4 times a second, something like that. So when you turn the x-rays on, you get beams through the patient, you know, through that 360 degrees over 280 milliseconds, something like that. You only need half of them to actually reconstruct an image. And so it's about 140, 150 milliseconds to get all the data you need to reconstruct a picture, which is a lot faster, obviously, than 12 seconds, right? Or 250 seconds. It's like 140 milliseconds. It's like sub-second acquisition. Not only that, this is the size of the voxel that is reconstructed. So it's a 0.5 millimeter by a 0.5 millimeter by, wait for it, 0.6 millimeters in the slice direction. So the 3D voxel has shrunk by orders of magnitude compared to these other techniques, right? It's a really, really high resolution technique. Probably, if you're honest, you could say that you're getting 7 frames a second. If you do motion correction and all this stuff, you play back a 3D movie, and probably it's about 7 frames a second is the true rate. But it's that whole volume, right? 7 times a second. It's pretty good. So these numbers. These are sort of most recent published or vendor given numbers. As we go through the course, we might come back and tune up some of these numbers. If you find, and you say, what, in nuclear medicine, they have a new detector, which, is twice as efficient, and it's going to to this down to 100 seconds, then we can update this number. Right? Okay, so we're going to go through each technique just to see it, the overview and how it works, what the basic structure is of the machine itself. This is, here's the ultrasound tech, the ultrasound machine. These are anywhere from 100 grand to 500, something like that. The great thing about these machines is they are on wheels and they plug into the wall, right? And so you just wheel this thing around the hospital. And if somebody's, got some kind of chest pain, or they're in some distress, they have some kind of pain anywhere, you just wheel this into their hospital by their hospital bed and take a look. Right? That is the power of this technique. It's remarkable. Not only that, these things are getting smaller and smaller. This unit here. I don't know if I have a picture, but we'll see the really small ones. I would say if there's a downside to this technique, it is the fact that this person, the ultrasound tech, needs to be highly trained and highly experienced to get really great results, right? It's really dependent on the operator's skills. And so, keeping these people employed at your place is difficult because they get really good and then they go, somewhere else. And so it's a great skill to have. And if you have a staff where everybody's good, then the world's your oyster. The reason skill is required is they really need to know the anatomy, and the anatomy is variable from person to person. And they need to know what is the important thing to capture at this moment, right, to present to a radiologist who's in a room in the back, not here, right? And in order to get the plane, so this is like a 2D plane that they're imaging, to get the exact plane that you want to image, the ultrasonographer needs to rotate and angle this transducer. And in real time, this will change. So so if I have a transducer and I tilt this way, then I get planes like this. If I tilt it back this way, I get planes across here. So they do that, and then they rotate to rotate that plane around, and then they get the sweet spot that radiologist likes to read or wants to see. And then using their left hand, in this case, this person's right-handed, they adjust both, the beam characteristics to get the picture that is required at that moment. Right? And there's many different options for those beam characteristics. We'll look at it. This person is getting what looks like their liver imaged. This structure here is big vessel by the look of it, and that color bar there gives flow, like the velocity of the flow at that pixel, right? So this is a terrific technique for seeing where things are leaking, or if there's a fistula or something, or some place where blood is getting through where it shouldn't be going. You can usually see it on echo. It's fantastic for looking at heart valves, etc. It's hard to make highly quantitative measurements with ultrasound, but it is attempted, and there's like 10,000 papers of people doing it. The machine itself can get really small, right? So a lot of, you know, cottage industry of making small ultrasound machines popped up 20 years ago, and the major manufacturers bought some of these and now have them as products. And so this is basically a big cell phone size with a normal transducer here that you have, and you just carry this around and look at your pictures on here, and then transmit the data to a, you know, a viewing system, right? So now you're really talking, because you can do this anywhere. You can, like, you're going camping, and you might need some ultrasound. You can do it. And these things are also quite cheap. They're not that expensive. So the other thing that I would encourage you to do is, in these slides and in the PDF, you'll see there are all these websites here. Just go hunt around at the manufacturers' websites and take a look at new products and new images. It's pretty impressive. So again, when you're imaging an object, so this is the heart here. This is the mitral valves, the aortic valves coming out here, right? This is the apex of the heart. And so the heart in this patient looks something like this. The peak part of the heart is down here. And the sonographer needs to get the transducer sometimes under the ribs and point it up towards the heart, and then get the apex and the base in the same plane for a few heartbeats. They watch it go. I don't know if there's a movie here. It doesn't look like it. And so, you know, that orientation, again, is a tilt and a rotation in order to get all of the chambers that are required to image in this patient, right? And then you rotate 90 degrees, for example. You take this orientation, give it another rotation, and you can get a different view through that roughly cylindrical object. Right? So rotate it and get a different cut through that view. So this is the left atrium. Here's the left atrium in this view. And this heart wall here is different than this heart wall, right? So again, this person is tremendously important for getting good studies. These are ultrasound views of the heart that are collected virtually in every ultrasound examination of the heart. The tech knows what to look for to get this. It's called a parasternal view, where you take the transducer and you find a gap between the ribs, and you rotate to get a long axis view of the heart from the top down, from the outside down. And then these two views, you move the transducer down under the ribs, and you look up toward the patient's head, and you get these what are called long axis views of the heart. And these two are rotated roughly about 90 degrees, somewhere in there, 60 to 90 degrees. And so then these are recorded, right, as part of the study, and then that gets shipped off, and somebody just actually plays through those recordings. You obviously can't change them once the study's over, right? So the physician who reads them is in a different room and usually reads them, say, that afternoon, as opposed to when the data was taken. So there's no going back most of the time, and you have to get the right stuff right off the bat. And you can see that there's, details, right? So yeah, I know this is the heart and I know this is the chamber, but yeah, it's pretty grainy. Specifically when it's a still photo like this, it's really grainy. Not only is it grainy, but there's a limited field of view that you trust. And then over here, there's just a big dark spot. You don't really see anything outside there, right? As you move, and we'll see when we do ultrasound physics, as you move deeper into the object, the resolution decreases. So you can image objects very close to the transducer with high spatial resolution, and then as we go deeper, the resolution decreases, particularly in this direction. Right? Normally, people view these not as still photos, but they view them as movies. And so the tech will hold the transducer there in the spot, and then with their left hand, they'll go record. And they record, say, 3 beats, lift off, and then say, they'll annotate that and ship it into the study. The alternate view of the heart that you acquire is when you put the transducer on between ribs and you go, if the heart's angled like this, you go perpendicular, and then you get these views that look like donuts, and those are called short axis views. And it's a nice view in the sense that it should be a circular object, right, or a cylindrical object, and it should symmetrically decrease its diameter as the heart beats. And it's pretty obvious when that's not happening, like when one half is sick. Just the geometry of it makes it pretty obvious and simple to read when there's an abnormality. It's also because of the frame rate that's available with ultrasound. Remember, it was about a 30 millisecond acquisition, so we get 30 frames a second, and even higher to some machines. It's great for looking at valves because they move pretty quickly, and the movies of valves are pretty impressive. Okay, here we go. We'll see some. So you can see it looks a lot better when it's in motion, right? I mean, just the coherence of what looks like a noisy signal. Like there's a lot of variability. It's not really a smooth signal here. It's a lot of variability, but the variability seems to move with the object, right? So this is called speckle, and it's little peaks in signal which come from sort of mesoscopic structures, not microscopic structures and not global heart-sized structures, but somewhere in between, and it'll create these signals that seem to move with the heart muscle. You can see also the ability to image the valve motion here. And to a certain extent, you can see that the resolution up here is better than it is down here, right? It starts to blur in this direction, whereas up here it's clearer. And so here's 3 different views of a heart looking at, well, here's the mitral valve. This is the mitral valve from a different angle, right? Left atrium is down. So, this is used a lot. And the reason it's used a lot is cardiologists have this machine in their office, right? So it's super convenient. And it doesn't involve radiation. You don't really have to inject any contrast in the patient, so you don't need to put a line in them unless there are some ultrasound things where you do, but mostly not. So it's pretty simple, right? They just take the shirt off and off you go. So it's very appealing. The downside of the technique is that if you're trying to measure a change in some physiological parameter, like what is the change in this patient's end diastolic volume from May through July or something like that. Measuring those types of numbers, it's very imprecise with echo. You get a lot of variability in making the measurement itself. You get 5 people to measure it, you get 5 completely different answers, right? So this is a place for, say, deep learning, where if you had ultrasound in a patient and in the same patient within, say, a few minutes, you had a CT scan. Say a CT scan, you can get the reproducible number every time. Then you might be able to train, a network to give more stable values of, say, ejection fraction or volumes, right? So that's a project that I'm sure somebody's working on, because there are so many ultrasound machines out there in the world. Here's a parasternal view right, of, again, this is the left atrium in the back. This is the left ventricle. This patient, this is another power of ultrasound, is when you put the transducer down and you look here, instantly, a few things are obvious. One, patient has a huge left atrium. That's not good, right? And you instantly have figured that out. Two, their left ventricle is contracting, but not that vigorously, right? So they're not in good shape, right? From a cardiac standpoint. Okay? Same with the right ventricle, doesn't seem to be contracting that well. The other thing you can do with echo, so our transducer's up here, okay, and the ultrasound beam is going this way. And so you send out a chirp pulse, a very short little boop, like a bat would send out to get a echolocation thing. So you send out that chirp, it hits something, reflects back. And if that thing is moving towards you, the sound coming back goes up in frequency, right? So you get a Doppler shift in the echo, right? It's exactly the way radar works for a speed trap, right? Where you shoot out the electromagnetic wave, it comes back. The shift in frequency tells you the velocity of the car. Same thing here. And you can do that many times a second. Like dip, 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 all those chirps go out, and then you listen to them coming back, and you just plot the velocity of the stuff in your field of view, right? So this is, basically the yellow is stuff that's moving towards the transducer, and blue is stuff that's moving away from the transducer. Okay? So you can see there's a burst here when this valve opens of blood moving towards the transducer, but also see this blue thing here? Excuse me. That little jet? Well, that's moving away from the transducer. Transducer's here. And that's the wrong direction, right? For blood to be moving, because this valve is supposed to close and there's no blood should be coming back this way. So what's happening when you see this little jet right here is the valve is coming and closing as much as it can, but there's a gap and blood comes back through, okay? That's called a regurgitant jet. And so again, the power of this technology is that you roll up to the patient in the ER and they're feeling like crap, and you put the transducer on, you look and you go, oh, well, you've got this big problem in that the blood's going the wrong way through this valve, right? And so their heart's beating, they're ejecting a lot of blood from their left ventricle, but half of it's going the wrong way, right? And that's why they feel like that. And you can do that just like that, right? So it's a great technology. There's usually a couple of them in the ER. And here, this is the recreational stuff, where you can actually create 3D models by you take the 2D plane on the ultrasound, and then it automatically scans back and forth. And you don't have to do it with your hand. You just put the transducer down, and this thing will either scan back and forth like this, or it'll rotate the beam around like this, and then you just create a 3-dimensional picture, right? And there's some very impressive recent software to create what's called cinematic 3D rendering, which you should Google it. Look up Siemens cinematic 3D rendering. And these fantastic 3-dimensional images come out of these things. So the frame rate of this, isn't that high. And so normally the quality of the image depends on whether the fetus is stationary. Like if it's in a stable state and it's sucking its thumb or something, you get this great picture. If on the other hand, it turns its head, then you get a very strange picture. And it's like, don't worry, that's just motion artifact. That is not, your baby. But you can imagine that doing this in other applications, like, for example, if you wanted to guide some kind of microsurgery, the intrauterine microsurgery, right? Then you would have this imaging device and your surgical tools going in, performing the surgery under this type of guidance, right? Which is pretty impressive. And the thing about ultrasound is all these transducers can be designed to have any shape, size, whatever you need, so that they get into a space that you need to image, right? So if you put, this is a normal linear array, which we've been seeing all those cardiac images. Normally just use a linear array like this and you tilt it to get the thing. You can get something that's more like a square as opposed to a linear array, so a square. And this is one where using the elements on the transducer, you can rotate the scan plane or make it go back and forth just by changing the phase of the ultrasound on the transducer. And then you get these awesome ones, right? Where you've got a transducer on the end of this device, which in laparoscopic surgery, you can just put through a port and put it inside right up against the thing that you're trying to figure out, should I pull this out or leave it there? And you just image it like very, very closely. Not only that, like a couple of students from my lab, when they went to Philips, they built a thing that came off the end here. And so it, using cameras or whatever, it always knew precisely where it was in a 3D coordinate system. And then you can put MRI on top of that and CT on top of that. And so the whole thing gets put together in this big guidance package, right? It's pretty cool. Another intraoperative transducer, which is flat, that you can get into a tight space and lay on something, to see. Suppose you're trying to ablate a tumor. You want to freeze it, like to kill it, or perhaps heat it to kill it. You can then put this in to see how the tissue has changed locally, say at the dome of the liver or something like that, right? As opposed to doing it from the outside of the patient, you can put this inside and just lay it right on top of the thing you're trying to image. There's this is from, I think is it there? Yes, it's here. This is one page of like 30 pages of different transducers, right? So there's many, many transducers available. All right, so let's look at nuclear medicine next. And nuclear medicine is it's a fascinating modality, and it's been around for a long time. Like when I was a grad student or an undergrad in physics in the mid 80s, this, gamma cameras, they were called back then, was a big deal in medicine. And it was basically a flat gamma camera, and you injected, same thing, you inject a radionuclide, which is a substance that has a radioactive decay that produces gamma rays or really high energy X-rays. And then the patient is glowing at that energy. Okay, so if you had X-ray glasses on, that patient would be glowing, right? Without the X-ray glasses, the X-rays just hit you and you don't know, right? So basically they're glowing. The thing that can see that energy is inside these detectors here. And it used to be called an anger camera. Now it's called a SPECT system. Normally when you inject an agent into a person, they will glow for, an hour, something like that. Depends on the substance. Some substances have a very short half-life, and so you have to get all your business done in 5-10 minutes, right? Because they're not going to glow that long. It's an exponential decay. And some last a long time. What you don't want is it to last 2 years, right? Because then they're bathed in radiation for a long, long time. So you usually pick agents for which the X-ray emission decays exponentially such it's all over in under an hour or something like that. Then you have to integrate how many X-rays did this patient absorb during this imaging session, right? And they calculate the dose of X-rays that they absorb, and does that produce risk for developing a cancer down the road? So this is a technology that exposes the patient to ionizing radiation. So it's the reason ionizing radiation is dangerous is it can make double strand breaks in DNA. And you get double strand breaks in DNA all the time, and you have repair mechanisms to fix them. But if you overwhelm those repair mechanisms, then you can either fix them incorrectly or not fix them. Right? So it's if somebody wanted to look at, we're not going to talk about dose much in this course in terms of like how you calculate what the maximum dose a person should get is. But if somebody wanted to do that as a project, that'd be great. So here's a traditional X-ray imaging that's been around since, I guess probably 1899 or something like that, where you have a source of X-rays here, and you essentially, this is like an X-ray light bulb, and you shine that light bulb through the patient, and you have a detector that detects X-rays. And so those X-rays that get through the patient hit the detector. And those X-rays that are absorbed by the patient.
But as for us,
those X-rays that are absorbed by the patient don't hit the detector. And so what you get here is a shadow, right? And that's your image, is the shadow cast by the patient. In emission imaging, this is transmission imaging. In emission imaging, such as single photon CT, the patient themselves is the source of those X-rays. Okay? So they're shining, you put the detector down, and you get a picture, spatial picture of where those X-rays are coming from. So if the contrast agent that is emitting the X-rays accumulates in one place, you'll get a very bright signal from that place. And that's the point. Oftentimes in cancer, and we'll see a couple of examples, if a patient, say, has a primary colon cancer, and you treat that, they go on chemo, etc., and you think you've got the primary cancer, oftentimes you'll go and get a PET scan and see if there are small cancerous lesions in other parts of the body called metastasis. So it might go to the liver, it might go to the brain, etc., and you just do a whole body PET scan to look for those metastases, because you can create a contrast agent that accumulates in tumors, right? And so you basically see these things light up. So that, I would say, that's its primary use outside cardiology, is in cancer detection, for either primary cancer detection or a metastasis. One issue with having the patient themselves be the source is that if you have an object deep inside the patient that has a certain amount of emission, say so many photons per second coming out of this volume, if it's inside the patient or deep inside the patient, there's a high probability that it will get absorbed by the patient on its way out, right? Versus something that's here, let me see if I can put a laser pointer, versus something that's here, when it emits an X-ray, there is a very low probability that it'll get absorbed because there just isn't much patient between this point and the detector. And so when you're creating nuclear medicine scans, when you look at your raw data, if I had a uniform activity, uniform X-ray or gamma ray emission as a function of space in here, other than these holes that are drilled in this phantom, the picture you would get without any correction looks something like this, right? And it's really bright on the edges, darker in the middle. But this is all due to probability of reabsorption of those, or absorption of those gamma rays by the patient. Normally, now what is done is a nuclear medicine machine isn't just a nuclear medicine machine, it's also a CT scanner. It'll have a CT scanner up front. You make CT of the patient, and then you measure the amount of radiation coming out of the patient with the nuclear scan, And you use the CT image to predict what is the probability that something from this point would get absorbed by the patient, right? If it's a high probability, then we need to amplify that signal because this isn't the true value that's coming out of that volume. It's what's coming out of that volume plus, it's been absorbed by the patient. And you can use the CT scan to compute that attenuation correction. So here's, after that attenuation correction is applied, you get rid of this, dark spot in the middle of the patient, right? So that's a key element of both PET scanning and basically SPECT, which is single photon emission tomography. So here's the geometric organization of a nuclear medicine scanner. Again, you're going to see a lot of heart examples because those are the pictures I have easily. This object should look familiar because we saw this geometric orientation in that picture of the patient. Remember this guy here? So here's one detector, here's the other detector, and they're at 90 degrees. And so this is what it looks like. We've got the patient here. The patient will, have the contrast agent that's emitting gamma rays, and these gamma rays will come out and get detected by this detector. You would like the detector to record all of the gamma rays that are coming in parallel rays this way. In that way, if I get an activity here, I can look back and say, well, I know that came from somewhere along this line, right? So it narrows down the possible origin of that gamma ray, right? And that's how we're doing this spatial encoding. These sepia are called basically a anti-scatter grid in which anything is coming at an angle. So say I have a gamma ray that comes along this path. If this wasn't here, it would just continue, light up the detector here, right? And you wouldn't know that it came from over here. With the sepia, basically only the stuff that if you stand behind it and look through the sepia, only the stuff on this line is going to light up this detector. And so they're essentially parallel beam projections through the patient. And that's a key element for doing this type of imaging. Ideally, you would have detectors down here and here as well, right? Because you prefer to just collect data all the time. There's a lot of gamma rays going this way that just fly off into the room and aren't recorded, right? So it's not that efficient. But just in terms of cost and simplicity of use, normally you have this type of orientation. And these two detectors then get rotated around the patient to take different views through the patient. So you can also align them in this orientation so that if I have a gamma ray coming this way or going that way, I'll get it recorded, and then the two detectors themselves will rotate around the patient over the course of a few minutes. And remember, in our SPECT, in our table of times for acquisition of images, nuclear medicine was pretty long, right? It was, I said, around 6 minutes or something, 250 seconds. And that's so that you can collect enough gamma rays at each one of these views. So you let it sit there, you collect for a while, rotate, collect for a while, rotate, collect for a while. If you built one of these things such that this whole object could rotate in 1/4 of a second, and you say, okay, well, I've got all my data in 250 milliseconds. That's great temporal resolution, but you would not have many counts, right? You just wouldn't have enough data to produce an image. How could you generate more counts? So remember, the way we got this patient to glow, how do we get him to glow? We injected a contrast agent, right? And then it goes to different parts of their body. And now they are the source, right? How could I get them to glow 5 times brighter? I could just inject 5 times more contrast, right? So you have to decide where is that point, right? You have the option. You can put as much in as you want. And so there's a balance between taking longer to acquire all of this data, because they're going to be glowing for some time, right? And if you put 5 times more, you could take 1/5 the time, but then when they walked out of the room, they'd still be glowing, right? And so you don't want them really to glow on the subway on the way home, right? Yeah.
So by contrast agent, the agents are able to either absorb or reflect gamma ray for the constant observations, and therefore we know that those agents will be accumulating as the targets that are
Right. The agent in this case actually is a chemical. It's called a radionuclide that has an atomic decay, which produces a gamma ray, right? And so the agent itself is the source of the gamma ray. So if I have the agent, the contrast agent, it's liquid and it's in a bottle. I put the bottle on the table. If I wore gamma ray glasses, it would be glowing hot, right? So usually you have it inside a little lead container or something so that it doesn't glow all over the whole room. And that's another part, you have to be skilled at handling radioactive materials to do this type of imaging. And you don't want to spill them, for example. And so when that goes in the patient, that material itself produces the gamma rays. And it will produce it at a certain rate, which decays away with time. And you're right, it accumulates. Sometimes you can make these agents be, you can combine them such they're part of a molecule that is used in metabolism, for instance. And so it gets taken up by the cell, as a sugar substitute and accumulates in places that are doing rapid metabolism and stuff like that.
This refers to the radioactive iodine for fine.
Well, yes, in the sense that is a therapeutic source. I mean, you want it to accumulate and you want it to deposit radioactive dose to a local place. And so, yeah, if you're using radioactive iodine as a therapy, you can do that. So most of the time, radiation therapy is done using an external beam. And so you would have something that produces gamma rays of a certain energy, and you beam them into the patient from many different angles such that at one location you get a lot of radiation, right? And so that is using, a different property though. However, CT scanning is used a lot, obviously, in designing how to create therapy beams, and from different angles, what strength should I use to hit my target, right? So that's an interesting thing. We've never put that in this course, like radiation therapy, but it's in some ways its accuracy is highly dependent on good imaging. And so, a lot of very innovative imaging has occurred in that sector, in the sense that people have taken simple X-ray machines and attached it to the front of a radiation therapy machine and made what's called a cone beam X-ray of the 3D volume, and then use that to program the radiation therapy. So that actually is probably a good thing to add to this course. But okay, so once you've acquired your data, you then display, as a function of position in this case in the heart, and these are these short axis views. You look at the brightness here. The very white stuff has high intensity emission of gamma rays, and the blue color or purple color here has low intensity emission of gamma rays. And so you can see in this heart, as we're going, from the base down towards the apex, you can see there's a chunk here that gets blue, and then there's a chunk that's just missing, right? And so that would indicate that the contrast agent you injected did not get to that tissue. So why did it not get to that tissue? It's because the vessels that should be feeding that tissue are blocked. And so the perfusion is low. And so they basically, what this says is, I inject this contrast agent, the patient should light up in a normal pattern. When they don't light up in a normal pattern, when there's something missing, there's a dark spot, then that means the contrast agent didn't get there. There's some reason the contrast agent didn't get there. So it's often used for what is called perfusion imaging, right? And ideally, you would like to get a map, a 3D map, and inside each voxel in that 3D image would be the perfusion value, which would be, say, in milliliters of blood per gram of tissue per minute. So that would be the quantitative perfusion estimate at that location, mils of blood per gram per minute that got in there, right? And by looking at the relative intensity of these images, you may be able to compute that actual blood flow. So oftentimes, in order to generate an abnormality, and these imaging systems are arranged such that you can have the patient either pedal on a bike, or you give them an agent that dilates all of their vessels to try and make a situation where they need more blood flow. It's stress. And then you'll take a SPECT image when they're at rest, and then you'll take the same nuclear medicine image when they're under stress. And you look for a change. And so at rest, you know, the blood flow to your tissues, say your heart, is about 5 mils per gram per minute, right? When you run for the bus, like you go, oh my God, I got to get there. And you run for 2 minutes, right? And your heart rate goes up to 140 or something like that. The blood flow can go up to as much as 50 mils per gram per minute. So it can get really high, right? And that's demand. The reason people have, say, pain when they run and they have poor circulation or they have poor vessels in their heart is that they can't meet that demand. So they want 50, but they're only getting 15, and it causes pain. Right? And so that the tissue becomes what's called ischemic. This imaging modality called SPECT, single photon emission computed tomography, and stress imaging purportedly measures this change in blood flow during stress. Okay, that's the ideal thing. And if you see the induction of a spot that gets worse, so for instance, this donut here, well, let's look at this one. This donut here, we had a little bit of off color here, so it might be low perfusion, but then under stress, we see a whole chunk of the heart now has low perfusion. And so you would say, that's a positive stress test. That person has a problem with their cardiac vessels because they can't get the flow up to a certain level. And so that, you know, this has been accepted as a way to diagnose heart disease now for 25 years or something. Between you and me, it doesn't work that well, right? It works pretty well for people who are really sick. But for the 50 to 75% of people that are in the middle, you can flip a coin on this thing. And we'll see data to show that that's the case. It basically, for the folks in the middle, it's not that useful. For people who are super normal, and they, you know, and it's okay. For people who are super abnormal, you can have confidence in the result. For people in the middle, and this is when we get to the comparison part of this course. One of the things is how do you estimate the precision and the reproducibility of your test? So we know what our purported spatial resolution is, our time resolution, et cetera. And then does it uncover, do those features uncover disease the way we want it to? Right. I need to figure out what time it is. This goes till 10 what? 50, thanks. Okay, we're at 36. I gotta get going. PET, proton or positron emission tomography, same basic technique as single photon emission. Single photon emission, a radionuclide event occurs here and a gamma ray comes out and you detect it, okay? In PET, a positron actually comes off of the element you inject into the patient, and it has a radioactive decay which produces a positron. The positron wanders around for a few microseconds, finds an electron, and they annihilate. That's a pretty cool thing, right? You've got something that has mass, it's a positron, something that has mass, it's an electron, right? When you combine them together, you get two things, neither of which seems to have mass, right? They're two photons and they go in opposite directions, right? And the reason they go in opposite direction is because the electron and the positron, you know, the momentum of those two particles when they met is pretty low. And so the momentum's conserved. And so the two photons go off in opposite directions, virtually opposite. It can be a small angle, but not much. So this is super powerful. The reason is when you detect a simultaneous ping here and here, you can draw a line between those 2 points and you know it happened somewhere along that line, right? It didn't happen anywhere else in this person. It happened somewhere along this line, right? And that line is very, very narrow, which is huge, right? So now you have, without doing any kind of sepia or anything like that, you can collect all of these photons and use them all to project these lines back through the patient. And so the spatial resolution turns out to be much better than the single photon version of this experiment, right? This is what a PET scanner looks like. Usually it also has a CT tucked away inside here, and you take a CT for this attenuation correction, and then the PET acquisition. This is the man in the back room behind the PET scanner, right? And it is a small particle accelerator. This is one of the downsides of this technique is you need a small particle accelerator on site in order to make the agent, right? So you usually have a target, you have a beam hitting the target, and then the stuff that comes out will have this positron source. And that's a bit of a downside. It's quite expensive. These people are super highly trained and skilled at running these things. And so it's kind of a big deal to get a PET scanner. It's becoming less of a big deal, I guess. So here's a CT scan of a heart here, and then this is what the PET image looks like for the PET agent from the myocardium, right? So it's really much better resolution than what we saw in SPECT. And you can map it back on top of the CT to see precisely where it's coming from. And it's much higher resolution, but expensive. Like to do one of these is you know, thousands of dollars, right? For detecting cancers, you know, you get a whole body CT for the attenuation correction, and you get a PET scan with these very bright spots here that indicate that there is some kind of tumor there that's taking up the PET contrast agent, right? And it's a very sensitive way of detecting both primary and metastasis. So again, you have primary tumor here, and then you're trying to detect whether or not there are mets in the bone around here, and you can see that this, you know, there's a lot of mets in the bone in that patient. So this changes the course of the therapy of that patient. Right? Computed tomography kind of looks like a PET scanner. It has an X-ray source and a detector down here. They're putting ECG leads on this person. This is a contrast injector so that you can put contrast into the vessels while you're doing the CT scan. The patient's on a table that has very precise ability to move, like to fractions of a millimeter, probably a quarter of a millimeter, up and down. So you can put the patient right exactly where you want them. The CT internal workings rotate very fast. That's why big companies make these machines like General Electric and Toshiba or Canon, Siemens, people who make, you know, power and things like that, or jet engines. And this is the detector array. It's about 1,000 by 256. So very low resolution for a camera, like on your phone. You know, it's not 12 megapixels, right? It's 1,000 by 256. However, it's an X-ray camera, and it can collect X-rays really fast while they're getting shot out of this X-ray light bulb, right? And you can change the energy of the X-rays coming out of here. And so they get absorbed differently by the patient, and make pictures that look like this, right? So this is a stack of axial slices through somebody's heart. And the spatial resolution here, these are coronary vessels, right? There's a little piece of calcium right there. These are the valves here. You know, this is the left atrium. There was a little bit of calcium on that valve. This is the right coronary artery here. Left coronary artery going down the top. I mean, it's just spectacular, right? So if you really want to know what's going on, it's hard to beat this technique. This person's pretty thin, and they held their breath very well, right? So there's two things going for them. When you're thin, a lot of X-rays can go through you, and so you cast a good shadow. If you're a big person, you shine the X-ray bulb, nothing gets through, right? And so you have to shine it brighter and brighter to get something through, right? And so it really matters, you know, in terms of image quality, just how big is the person. But this is the kind of, so that stack of images, when you put that stack together and then you render the voxels in three-dimensional space just with a color scheme such that, you know, bright pixels look gold and bright on this, you get these pictures, right? Which is ridiculously good, right? You know, this is the right coronary artery here, a branch coming off it, left main, left anterior descending, circ. You know, this is the right coronary artery going down the posterior wall of the heart. Just fantastic pictures. Looking at whether or not to call a patient normal or abnormal with coronary disease. You can see a narrowing of a vessel and measure that narrowing. You know, you look at it from two different angles and you see that there's a tightness in that vessel. And so you could measure the diameter and say, like, what is the percentage of reduction in the diameter of that vessel? It turns out people don't do that. What they do is they call these just through experience. They would look at this and go, yeah, that's not going to be significant, right? And so they become like a human deep learning system just through example. And when they get a call wrong, they hear about it from cardiology, because cardiology will go do a cath, which is an X-ray image where you inject dye, and they'll look and say, this patient's normal. Why did you send us this patient? And so that feedback loop, you know, is the training part, right? And so they learn not to send patients. Chest CT, for example, you know, looking at accumulation of water or pneumonia type of stuff in the lung is probably one of the best. Here's a, you know, is this thing here a lesion or is it a normal structure? This is where human observation comes in and experience. It's like, no, that you don't see that. That's a lesion. That's probably, this is sepsis, actually. It's an infection. Well, let's see if I can get. So this is pneumonia down here, right? You can see it kind of, the water tends to drop with gravity to some extent, and then this is COVID. And there are a lot of papers, obviously, on confirming a COVID diagnosis when somebody felt they had COVID, their test was negative, whatever. You can do this and see how they look. These When you take this scan takes, as I said, 140 milliseconds. This dark signal here is actually an embolism that's inside the vessel, right? So is this dark signal here. And a human can recognize that very quickly with experience. They just go up and down and go, whoop, that's embolic. Cardiac MRI. MRI is done with radio frequency coils that are placed on top of the patient. There are coils underneath this patient as well. And normally you take an ECG of the patient and you might inject a contrast agent into the patient to look at the uptake of the contrast in the tissue or highlight vessels. And here's, this is when I said, if the patient can hold their breath for 12 beats and you can collect images over multiple beats, you can get movies that look like this, right? Which is hard to beat, right? I mean, in terms of deciding whether or not that myocardium is contracting properly, it's beautiful data, right? And this patient, their myocardium looks a little thick to begin with, right? But it's certainly contracting very well on each frame. And just like in ultrasound, when we looked at those long axis pictures in MRI, you can pick any plane orientation you want. So normally you do a set of scout images, and using those scout images, you then cut planes of particular interest. This plane is picked because we see the left atrium here, right atrium here, right ventricle and left ventricle. Right? And you can see the septum or the muscle here is contracting absolutely normally, as well as the free wall. This is called the lateral wall. And then the orthogonal view. And like, see this rotation of blood here? See how that's swirling? The fact that it shows up in this image was taken over 12 heartbeats. That swirling had to reproduce itself every time in order for that to show up. Otherwise, it just gets jumbled, right? You wouldn't see any coherent pattern. So that actually, if you did a velocity profile, you would see this sort of rotational motion of the blood in the aorta. This is a cardiac vein, that big old thing right there. Great cardiac vein. Again, left atrium, valve plane, myocardium. So MRI, when it works, it's fantastic. It's just great. Here's short axis end diastole when the heart is full, and systole when it's ejected the most blood that it can. With MRI, you can also place lines in the tissue using a saturation pulse. This is called myocardial tagging. I did this a lot as a young person. And then you can actually measure quantitatively how that pattern deforms, in order to make a very high resolution quantitative estimate of the muscle itself and how well it's performing. I think we can see how it performs over time, although this is a digital artifact, some kind of encoding artifact. Here's one where we put a grid on this heart, and you can see the grid deform over time, right? So you just pick one of these tiny little things. They're like 4 millimeters square. Watch how that deforms over time. You can measure the strain of the myocardium at that point in the heart. This is a PhD student of mine, probably 20 years ago now. This, and then here's blood flow. You can, because of time, you can look this up on YouTube, but you can measure with phase shifts from MR a beautiful 4-dimensional blood flow field going through the aorta. And the last thing we'll look at is a cath lab. Patient goes on this table. This is a detector. This is an X-ray tube, and you just orient it such that the X-rays shoot through the patient, and then you look at what's in your field of view up here in real time. And most of the time it looks like this, right? If it's an interesting case, there's a lot of people interested in what's going on, if they're implanting something, etc. And everybody's looking at it in real time as they're manipulating a catheter in real time to, make the image. And it'll look like this. So this is a catheter. It's a plastic tube that's engaged into the left main here. and then you inject contrast agent into the vascular tree, and you see this beautiful projection of the vascular tree, getting rid of this volume averaging. Okay, well. Okay, that's it. And okay, quick news. I'm not going to be here on Thursday. I'm not going to be here on Tuesday. I got assigned this course late, and that travel was already planned, so I can't get out of it. So you can watch the lecture. Thursday's lecture, Tuesday's lecture will be online. I'll get them. I think Thursday's is already online. I'll get them up.
By Zoom or record?
No, it'll be recorded.
Okay, so we just watch the lecture recording. We
Yep.
don't have to be here, and also we don't have to be on Zoom.
That's correct. There's no Zoom session. You just have to watch the lecture, the two lectures, Thursday's lecture and Tuesday's lecture, by next Thursday. Okay. Okay, thanks. Any questions from you guys online? Are we good? It's like everybody's good. All right, terrific.
How do you detect the slide impact?